The dim glow of an artificial sunrise spilled across the sprawling expanse of Yara Station, a floating hub in the outer verge where law was flexible and morality negotiable. Here, amid the distant hum of fusion cores and the acrid tang of coolant leaks, Arden Vance thrived, a mechanic with grease-streaked hands and a stubborn sense of justice that often got him into trouble. He stood out among the mercenaries, traders, and grifters not because of his human heritage, a rarity in these parts, but because of the way he approached the universe, with an almost reckless compassion. Arden was in his workshop when the station's intercom crackled, announcing another wave of ships docking for repairs. His small space, nestled in the labyrinthine guts of Yara Station, smelled of burnt wires and stale coffee. Tools lay scattered across workbenches, and holographic schematics of broken ships floated in midair, displaying damage reports that made even seasoned engineers wince. "The universe doesn't owe you anything, Arden," his mentor's voice echoed in his mind, gravelly and stern. It was a lesson Arden had ignored for years. He wiped his hands on his patched coveralls and glanced at the parts ledger on his terminal. Credits were tight, tighter than he'd ever admit aloud. His own ship, the Vagabond, sat in dock with a busted hyperdrive coil, and he'd spent the last 6 months scrounging for enough credits to replace it. A mechanic without a working ship was a paradox that stung every time he thought about it. "Vance, you've got another walk-in," crackled Joro's voice over the comm. The grizzled station administrator had a knack for understatement. Arden sighed and pushed the button. "Send Bem down. Hope they've got something to trade." Minutes later, the workshop door slid open with a hiss, and in shuffled someone Arden had never seen before, an alien with scales that shimmered like spilled oil under the flickering fluorescent lights. The creature's tall, willowy frame suggested fragility, but the set of its piercing eyes told a different story. It wore tattered robes that hung loosely over a body that looked like it hadn't eaten properly in weeks. "You are the mechanic." The alien's voice was melodic, but its tone carried the weight of desperation. Arden grabbed a rag and wiped his hands, nodding. "That'd be me. Name's Arden. What's the problem?" The alien hesitated, glancing around the cluttered workshop as if searching for hidden answers. Finally, it spoke. "My vessel, it cannot fly." It struggled with the words, as though explaining its plight to a stranger was a burden it hadn't anticipated. "I require assistance. I have no credits, but I can—" "Stop right there," Arden interrupted, raising a hand. "No credits. That's going to be a problem. I've got a ledger to balance, and charity work doesn't pay the rent." The alien's shoulders slumped, its confidence draining like coolant from a ruptured pipe. "Please," it said softly. "My kind, we are not welcome here. I cannot ask anyone else. If I cannot repair my ship—" It trailed off, leaving the consequences unspoken but painfully clear. Arden studied the creature. Its robes were threadbare, its posture weary, but its eyes burned with a quiet defiance. He'd seen that look before, in refugees, in runaway slaves, in people who had nowhere left to turn. It was a look that made his gut twist, a reminder of the kind of person he'd vowed to be. "All right," he said, against his better judgment. "Let's take a look at your ship." The alien's face lit up, a shimmer of gratitude breaking through the weariness. "Thank you, truly." As they walked to the docking bay, Arden couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Helping someone in need was second nature to him, but in a place like Yara Station, kindness had a cost. Still, he pushed the thought aside. The universe might not owe him anything, but that didn't mean he couldn't tip the scales once in a while. The alien's ship was a relic, a patchwork of mismatched parts barely held together by hope and duct tape. Arden whistled low as he circled it, noting the scorch marks along the hull and the jury-rigged power couplings. This thing shouldn't even be in space, he muttered, half to himself. It was all I could afford, the alien said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into its tone. Relax, Arden said, waving a hand. I've seen worse. Let's pop the hood and see what we're dealing with. As he worked, he found himself asking questions, partly out of curiosity, partly to distract from the growing list of problems he was uncovering. The alien's name, it revealed, was Lyric, a name that matched its voice. It came from a planet Arden had never heard of, fleeing a war he hadn't known existed. Its story was fragmented, as though speaking it aloud might make the pain too real to bear. Why here? Arden asked as he examined a frayed power conduit. Yara's not exactly a safe haven. Lyric hesitated, its scaled hands twisting nervously. It was the last place, the only place. And I heard. It stopped, its gaze drifting to the far wall of the docking bay. I heard there was a human here who could help. Arden paused, his hands stilling on the conduit. He didn't ask who'd told Lyric that or why it had believed them. Instead, he said, well, you heard right. Hours later, as the station's artificial night cycle began, Arden wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed his work. The ship was far from space-worthy, but he'd patched enough to get it limping to the next port. There was just one problem. Your primary coupling is shot, he said, gesturing to the charred piece of equipment. I can replace it, but the part isn't cheap. Lyric's expression darkened, its shoulders sagging once more. I have nothing to offer you, it said quietly. Arden frowned, glancing at the part in his hand. The price tag still stung, a reminder of how close he was to fixing his own ship. But as he looked at Lyric, standing there with nothing but hope and desperation, he felt that old, stubborn sense of justice flare up again. Don't worry about it, he said, slipping the part into his toolkit. I'll figure something out. Lyric's eyes widened, its voice trembling. Why? Why would you? Arden shrugged, forcing a grin. Call it a bad habit. Now let's get this thing installed. As they worked late into the night, the hum of the station fading into the background, Arden couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble he was inviting into his life. But for now, he pushed the thought aside. Sometimes, doing the right thing was its own reward, even if it came at a cost. The artificial night on Yara Station was a far cry from the serene darkness of space. Neon lights buzzed intermittently, casting uneven pools of green and purple across the docking bay as Arden leaned against a crate, studying Lyric. He tried to piece together who this alien really was and why they'd ended up in his workshop. There were countless stories of refugees from conflicts scattered across the verge, but few risked a station like Yara unless they were truly desperate or running from something worse. So, Arden said, breaking the silence. His voice echoed faintly in the cavernous bay. You've got your ship patched enough to limp out of here. What's your next stop? Lyric hesitated, its long fingers grazing the edge of a control panel. It seemed to weigh its words, an air of secrecy clinging to its every move. I need to reach the outer drift. There is a sanctuary there. Arden snorted, folding his arms. Sanctuary, out there. Hate to break it to you, but the outer verge doesn't have much in the way of welcoming committees. Not for you, perhaps, Lyric said sharply, its melodic voice hardening. But my kind have alliances, hidden places where we are safe. Your kind. Arden pressed, raising an eyebrow. He wanted answers, but he knew better than to push too hard. Refugees carried secrets like cargo, heavy and fragile, and cracking them open often meant inheriting their burdens. Lyric's luminous eyes met his, unwavering. My kind, you do not need to know more. You have already done more than most would. Arden exhaled slowly, scratching at the stubble on his jaw. The alien's reticence was frustrating, but it wasn't his place to pry. Not yet, at least. "All right," he said, pushing off the crate. "But if you're heading out that way, you'll need more than patched-up wiring and hope. That Part 1 gave you a hold, but just barely. What do you suggest?" Lyric asked, tilting its head slightly. The question wasn't idle. There was a genuine curiosity there, as if it was beginning to trust him, or at least to listen. "Supplies," Arden said, ticking off items on his fingers. "Fuel cells, backup power converters, food if you need it, though I'm not sure what you eat. And weapons, if you've got a way to use them." Lyric's face tightened, the shimmer of its scales dimming slightly. "I do not fight." Arden gave a half-smile. "Yeah, well, sometimes the fight finds you. Especially out there." The alien didn't respond immediately. Instead, it turned its attention back to the ship, its hands tracing invisible patterns along the hull. Arden watched, noting the precise, almost reverent way Lyric moved. Whoever this being was, they cared deeply for the vessel, not just as a means of escape, but as something more. He'd seen that kind of connection before, back when his own ship had been more than a hunk of junk rusting in the dock. "You're serious about this sanctuary?" he asked after a moment. "Yes." Lyric's voice was steady, though there was an edge to it now, a steely determination that belied its fragile appearance. "It is the only option." Arden sighed, his resolve softening. "All right, look. I know a trader on the lower levels who deals in off-the-record goods. If you're looking for supplies, she might cut you a deal. Or at the very least, she won't ask too many questions." Lyric's eyes brightened slightly. "You would introduce me?" "I'll take you there," Arden said, "but you'll need to be careful. Yara Station isn't exactly overflowing with goodwill, especially for strangers who don't have credits to spare." The alien nodded, its movements deliberate. "I understand. And thank you, Arden Vance. Your kindness will not be forgotten." "Yeah, well, let's see if it gets us both killed first," he muttered under his breath. The lower levels of Yara Station were a labyrinth of narrow corridors and dimly lit alcoves where deals were made and lives were lost with equal frequency. Arden led the way, his posture tense but practiced, a man who knew how to navigate the shadows without drawing too much attention. Lyric followed closely, its shimmering robes drawing a few curious glances from the denizens of the station. They reached a small storefront tucked behind a rusted bulkhead, the neon sign overhead flickering weakly. Inside, a stout woman with cybernetic arms was dismantling a pulse rifle with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. "Arden," she said without looking up, her voice carrying a mix of amusement and exasperation. "What trouble are you dragging through my door this time?" "Nice to see you too, Kira," Arden said, stepping inside. "Got a friend here who needs some gear. Thought you might help." Kira finally looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied Lyric. "Friend, huh? You've got some interesting taste these days." "Not like that," Arden said quickly, shaking his head. "They're just passing through, heading to the drift." Kira's expression softened slightly, though her wariness didn't entirely fade. "All right, let's see what you're after, then." As Lyric began explaining its needs, Arden stepped back, letting the alien handle the conversation. He watched as Kira's initial skepticism gave way to something else, not trust, exactly, but a grudging respect. It was a reminder that even in a place like Yara, where survival often came at the expense of others, there were still moments where connections could be forged, however tenuous. But as Arden scanned the room, his instincts prickled. A figure lingered in the shadows near the entrance, their gaze fixed on Lyric. He didn't recognize them, but their posture and the subtle bulge under their jacket set off alarm bells. Trouble, he thought grimly. And it's found us already. Arden's grip tightened on the hilt of the tool he'd tucked into his belt. A wrench more than a weapon, but solid enough to break a wrist or worse if necessary. His eyes darted toward the figure lingering at the entrance to Kira's shop. The man had the look of a predator, casual yet coiled, waiting for the right moment to strike. Arden's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. "Lyric," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "Wrap up. We've got company." The alien turned toward him, its luminous eyes widening slightly. It didn't ask questions, a small relief, but Arden could see the tension ripple through its delicate frame. Lyric nodded and turned back to Kira, quickly concluding their transaction. Kira glanced between them, her mechanical hands pausing midair. "What's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Arden said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone with a little too much interest in my friend here." Kira's expression darkened. "You need me to handle it?" "No," Arden said quickly. He didn't doubt Kira could hold her own. He'd seen her dismantle more than just weapons in her time, but dragging her into this wasn't an option. "Just keep an eye out." The man at the entrance shifted, his movements subtle but deliberate. Arden caught the glint of metal under his jacket as he turned slightly, as if confirming he'd been spotted. Arden's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help either of them now. Lyric finished securing its newly acquired supplies and stepped back from the counter. Its hands clutched a small satchel tightly, the shimmering scales along its arms faintly dimmed as if reflecting its unease. Arden gave Kira a quick nod and motioned for Lyric to follow him toward the rear exit. "Not the main door," he said quietly, "just in case." They slipped through a narrow passage at the back of the shop, emerging into a maze of maintenance corridors lit by flickering strips of pale light. The air was stale and carried the faint tang of oil and ozone. Arden's boots scuffed against the metal grating as he led Lyric deeper into the maze, his ears straining for the sound of footsteps behind them. "Do you know him?" Arden asked, glancing over his shoulder. "No," Lyric said, its voice barely above a whisper. "But I have seen his kind before. They are hunters." "Hunters," Arden repeated, his brow furrowing. "What, like bounty hunters?" Lyric hesitated, then nodded. "Of a sort. They do not seek only rewards. Some hunt for other reasons: power, vengeance, fear." "Great," Arden muttered. "Just what we needed." A faint sound echoed down the corridor, the soft, deliberate scrape of a boot against metal. Arden froze, holding up a hand to stop Lyric. The alien stilled immediately, its head tilting slightly as it listened. The sound came again, closer this time. Arden glanced around, his mind racing. The maintenance corridors were a labyrinth, but that was both an advantage and a risk. They could lose their pursuer if they moved quickly and smartly, but one wrong turn could trap them. "This way," he whispered, motioning to a side passage. Lyric followed without hesitation, its movements eerily silent despite the uneven floor. Arden led them through a series of turns, choosing paths at random in the hope of throwing off their tail. But no matter how far they went, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Finally, they reached a small alcove where a broken terminal cast faint sparks into the air. Arden motioned for Lyric to stop, then pressed himself against the wall, peering back the way they'd come. The corridor was empty, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. "We can't keep running like this," he said quietly. "If they're tracking you, they'll find us no matter where we go." Lyric's luminous eyes flickered, its expression unreadable. "What do you suggest?" Arden hesitated. Confrontation wasn't his first choice, but he couldn't see another way out. "We set a trap," he said finally. If they want to follow us, we'll make them regret it. Lyric's gaze lingered on him for a moment before it nodded slowly. Very well. What do you need me to do? Arden exhaled, already running through the plan in his mind. Stay out of sight. I'll draw them in. When I give the signal, you make a break for it. And what will you do? Handle the hunter, Arden said, his voice steady despite the unease coiling in his gut. One way or another. Lyric didn't argue, though its gaze lingered on him as if weighing the risk. Finally, it stepped back into the shadows, its shimmering form blending almost seamlessly with the dim light. Arden turned his attention back to the corridor, his grip tightening on the wrench at his side. The sound of footsteps returned, louder now, accompanied by the faint hum of something mechanical. Arden's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the open, forcing himself to appear calm. The figure emerged from the shadows moments later, their face partially obscured by a hood. In one hand, they held a compact energy weapon that hummed ominously. "You've been busy," the hunter said, their voice low and gravelly. "Hand over the alien, and I'll make this quick." Arden smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'll pass. Thanks for the offer, though." The hunter's eyes narrowed, their grip tightening on the weapon. "You don't know who you're dealing with, human." "Funny," Arden said, raising the wrench slightly. "I was about to say the same thing." The hunter lunged, the hum of their energy weapons slicing through the stale air of the maintenance corridors. Arden barely ducked in time, the charged bolt searing the wall where his head had been a second earlier. The acrid scent of scorched metal filled his nostrils as he rolled sideways, gripping his wrench tighter. "Nice shot," he called out, his voice carrying a mock bravado that barely masked the adrenaline surging through him. "But I'm not handing over anyone today." The hunter snarled, their hood falling back to reveal a gaunt, cybernetic face. A glowing red optic word as it focused on him, scanning, calculating. "You're wasting your breath," they growled. "That alien's a marked target. You're out of your league." Arden smirked, though his mind raced for options. "Yeah, well, I've always had a soft spot for lost causes." The hunter raised their weapon again, but this time Arden didn't wait. He charged, swinging the wrench in a wide arc. The hunter sidestepped within human speed, but Arden had anticipated it. He dropped low, sweeping his leg out to catch the hunter's ankle. The move was clumsy but effective. The hunter stumbled, their energy weapon clattering to the ground. Arden didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward, slamming the wrench against the weapon, sending a spray of sparks as it was rendered useless. The hunter cursed, their cybernetic arm snapping out to grab Arden by the throat. He gasped as the grip tightened, his feet leaving the ground. "You should have stayed out of this," the hunter hissed, their voice cold and mechanical. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air. The hunter froze, their head jerking toward the source of the sound. Arden barely registered the glint of metal flying through the air before the grip on his throat loosened, and he crashed to the floor, coughing. From the shadows, Lyric stepped forward, their arm extended. A small, glowing blade hovered midair, spinning slowly as if awaiting a command. The hunter turned to face Lyric, their expression shifting from anger to something closer to fear. "You," the hunter spat, their voice shaking slightly. "You're not just some refugee." Lyric didn't respond. Their luminous eyes burned brighter as the blade shot forward, grazing the hunter's shoulder with a precision that was anything but accidental. The hunter yelped, retreating a step. "Leave," Lyric said, their voice calm but unyielding. "You will not follow us." The hunter hesitated, their cybernetic fingers twitching. For a moment, Arden thought they might charge again, but then they snarled and turned, disappearing down the corridor without another word. The blade dissolved into a faint shimmer as Lyric lowered their arm, their scales dimming slightly. Arden pushed himself to his feet, rubbing his sore neck as he eyed the alien warily. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're going to have to explain that one." Lyric's gaze flicked to him, their expression unreadable. "I did what was necessary. They will not return." "Yeah, I got that part," Arden said, gesturing vaguely. "What I mean is, what the hell was that? That thing you did with the blade?" Lyric hesitated, their hands folding in front of them. "It is a gift, a remnant of my people's knowledge. It is not something I use lightly." Arden frowned, his curiosity battling with his better judgment. He wanted to press further, to understand what Lyric was capable of and what it might mean for the trouble they were in. But the exhaustion in the alien's posture gave him pause. "All right," he said, finally relenting. "We'll save the Q&A for later. Right now, we need to keep moving." Lyric nodded, their movements slow and deliberate. "Where will we go?" Arden glanced down the corridor, his mind racing. The hunter might have been scared off, but he doubted they were working alone. Whoever was after Lyric wasn't going to give up so easily. "There's an old service lift a few levels down," he said. "It'll take us to the lower docks. From there, we can figure out our next move." Lyric's luminous eyes met his, and for the first time, Arden thought he saw something close to trust in their gaze. "Lead the way," they said softly. The corridors grew darker as they descended, the hum of the station's machinery growing louder. Arden moved quickly but carefully, his senses on high alert. Lyric followed silently, their presence a faint shimmer in the corner of his vision. When they finally reached the lift, Arden hesitated. The control panel was ancient, its surface scarred and corroded. He pried open the casing, grimacing at the mess of wires inside. "Figures," he muttered, pulling a multi-tool from his belt. "This thing hasn't seen maintenance in decades." As he worked, Lyric stood guard, their gaze scanning the shadows. The tension between them was palpable, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Arden's hands moved quickly, his mind replaying the encounter with the hunter. Whoever Lyric was, whatever they carried with them, it was worth killing for or dying to protect. Finally, the lift jolted to life with a groan, the doors sliding open to reveal a dimly lit chamber. Arden gestured for Lyric to step inside, then followed, his wrench still in hand. As the doors closed behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were descending deeper into more than just the station. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "if we're going to keep this up, you're going to have to trust me a little more." Lyric turned to him, their expression thoughtful. "And if I do?" Arden shrugged, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then maybe we both make it out of this alive." The lift shuddered to a stop, its ancient mechanisms grinding like a dying animal. Arden gripped the railing as the doors creaked open to reveal the lower docks, a sprawling expanse of dimly lit hangars and storage bays. The air was colder here, tinged with the sharp scent of coolant leaks and industrial solvents. Shadows clung to every corner, broken only by the occasional flicker of a faulty overhead light. "Welcome to the belly of the beast," Arden muttered, stepping out cautiously. Lyric followed silently, their luminous eyes scanning the space. The tension in their posture hadn't eased since the encounter with the hunter, and Arden couldn't blame them. Down here, trouble could come from anywhere or anyone. Arden led the way, his boots echoing against the metal floor. He avoided the main pathways, sticking to the narrow walkways between rows of abandoned ships and cargo containers. The lower docks were a graveyard of forgotten vessels, their hulls rusting and gutted for parts. Arden's trained eye couldn't help but catalog the wreckage as they passed. A decommissioned mining shuttle, A freighter with its cockpit shattered, a sleek courier ship stripped to its bones. Each told story, though none ended well. "What is this place?" Lyric asked, their voice soft but curious. "Scrap zone, mostly," Arden replied. "Old ships get hauled down here to rot or be picked apart. Sometimes people live down here, too. Folks who don't want to be found." Lyric nodded, their gaze lingering on a row of cargo crates stacked precariously against a wall. "It is quiet, but not safe." Arden glanced at them, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "That's one way to put it." They reached a clearing where a half-collapsed shuttle provided some cover. Arden motioned for Lyric to stop, then crouched low, peering around the edge of the hull. The faint hum of activity reached his ears. Voices, machinery, the unmistakable crackle of a comm unit. Someone was nearby. "Stay here," Arden whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll check it out." Lyric's eyes flickered with unease, but they nodded. "Be careful." Arden crept forward, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who'd spent years navigating dangerous situations. He slipped between the shadows, his hand never leaving the wrench tucked into his belt. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and he caught sight of a group gathered near a small shuttle docked at a private bay. 3 figures stood around a makeshift workstation, their features obscured by the dim light. One of them, a tall man with a cybernetic arm, gestured emphatically at a holographic map projected above the table. Arden's stomach sank as he recognized the cybernetic enhancements, similar to those of a hunter they'd encountered earlier. "They can't have gone far," the tall man was saying, his voice low and clipped. "We've got the upper levels locked down. They'll try to slip out through the docks. And if they don't," another figure asked, their tone skeptical. "Then they're trapped," the man replied. "Either way, we find them." Arden's mind raced. It was clear they weren't just being followed. They were being hunted. He slipped back the way he'd come, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached Lyric, he crouched beside them, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," he said quietly. "There's a team down here looking for us. They've locked down the upper levels, which means our only way out is through these docks." Lyric's eyes narrowed. "How many?" "3 that I saw. Might be more," Arden replied. "They've got tech, good tech, and they're organized." Lyric's gaze shifted, their expression thoughtful. "Then we must move quickly. If they are coordinating, they will converge on us soon." Arden nodded, his jaw tightening. "There's an old launch bay near the outer edge of the docks. It's risky, but if we can make it there, we might be able to find a ship that'll still fly." "And if there is not?" Lyric asked. "Then we improvise," Arden said, a grim determination in his voice. "Come on, stay close." They moved quickly but cautiously, weaving through the maze of wreckage. Arden's senses were on high alert, every creak and whisper of the station setting his nerves on edge. Lyric followed with a quiet grace that made them almost invisible, their shimmering form blending with the shadows. As they approached the launch bay, a sudden noise stopped them in their tracks. A heavy thud echoed through the corridor, followed by the unmistakable whine of a drone's engines. Arden cursed under his breath as a spherical drone zipped into view, its scanning beam sweeping the area. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Lyric behind a rusted cargo container. The drone hovered nearby, its sensor array glowing faintly. Arden's grip tightened on his wrench as he watched it, his mind racing for a solution. The drone was small but heavily armed, and any confrontation would draw attention they couldn't afford. "Can you disable it?" Arden whispered to Lyric. The alien considered for a moment, then nodded. "I will need a distraction." Arden exhaled slowly, his pulse quickening. "All right. On my signal." He waited until the drone's beam swept away from their hiding spot, then darted out, yelling and waving his arms. The drone's sensors locked onto him immediately, its weapons priming with a mechanical whir. Arden dove behind another container as a burst of energy bolts struck the ground where he'd been standing. From the corner of his eye, he saw Lyric move. Their hand extended, and a faint, shimmering thread of energy shot out, wrapping around the drone like a net. The machine froze midair, its lights flickering wildly before it crashed to the ground with a metallic clatter. "Nice work," Arden said, his voice breathless as he rejoined Lyric. "We must keep moving," Lyric said, their tone urgent. "They will have heard that." Arden nodded, adrenaline surging through him as they sprinted toward the launch bay. The walls seemed to close in around them, the echoes of their footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Arden couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every step brought them closer to a confrontation they couldn't avoid. But there was no turning back now. The only way out was forward. The launch bay loomed ahead, its towering blast doors half open, exposing the cavernous chamber to the void beyond. Arden's boots pounded against the grated floor as he sprinted toward it, Lyric close on his heels. The sound of pursuit echoed behind them, shouted orders, the thudding march of boots, and the telltale hum of drones. Their pursuers were closing in. "There!" Arden shouted, pointing to a ship at the edge of the bay. It was a battered freighter, its hull pockmarked and scorched, but its engines were intact, and the access ramp was down. It would have to do. As they raced toward the freighter, a sharp, metallic clang reverberated through the bay. Arden glanced over his shoulder to see a squad of heavily armed figures pouring through the entrance, their weapons raised. A barrage of energy bolts lit up the bay, sizzling through the air and striking the ground around them. "Get to the ship," Arden yelled, throwing himself behind a stack of crates for cover. He fired off a burst from the salvage plasma pistol he'd picked up earlier, the shots forcing their attackers to scatter. Lyric hesitated for only a moment before nodding and dashing toward the freighter. Their movements were fluid, almost otherworldly, as they dodged the incoming fire. Arden's heart pounded as he covered them, his shots wild but effective enough to keep the enemy at bay. Lyric reached the ramp and turned back, their luminous eyes locking onto Arden. "Come," they called, their voice cutting through the chaos. Arden didn't need to be told twice. He broke from cover, sprinting toward the ship as energy bolts sizzled past him. His muscles burned, and his lungs felt like they might burst, but he didn't stop. He reached the ramp just as a drone swooped down, its weapons priming for a lethal strike. "Down!" Lyric shouted, their hands snapping out. The shimmering thread of energy they'd used earlier shot forth, coiling around the drone and yanking it to the ground with a deafening crash. Arden didn't pause to admire their work. He scrambled up the ramp and into the freighter, slamming the control to retract it behind him. Inside, the ship was a mess of wires, exposed panels, and flickering lights. Arden darted toward the cockpit, his fingers flying over the controls as he initiated the startup sequence. The engines groaned in protest, but roared to life, the vibration rattling through the deck. "We're not out of this yet," Arden muttered, his hands steady despite the chaos. "Strap in." Lyric took a seat behind him, their gaze fixed on the view ahead. Through the cockpit's cracked viewport, the squad of pursuers was visible, their weapons aimed at the ship. Arden gritted his teeth as he powered up the shields, just in time to absorb the impact of another barrage. "Hold on," he warned, yanking the controls. The freighter lurched upward, its thrusters blazing as it lifted off the deck. The pursuers scattered, their shouts drowned out by the roar of the engines. But the danger wasn't over. As the ship ascended, a warning alarm blared, the console flashing red. Arden's stomach sank as he spotted a sleek interceptor ship rising to meet them, its weapon systems locking on. "They're not letting us go that easy," he muttered. Lyric leaned forward, their expression calm, but intense. "I can help. But you must trust me." Arden hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Do whatever you've got to do." Lyric placed their hands on the console, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. A surge of energy coursed through the ship, and Arden felt the systems respond, their sluggishness replaced by an almost sentient awareness. The engines roared louder, the shields pulsing with renewed strength. The interceptor fired, its shots streaking toward them like fiery lances. But the freighter moved with impossible agility, dodging the blasts with precision. Arden gripped the controls, his instincts syncing with the ship as if it were an extension of himself. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice strained. "Guiding," Lyric replied, their voice layered with an ethereal resonance. "This vessel is old but strong. It remembers what it was made to do." Arden didn't fully understand, but he didn't need to. He focused on the interceptor, weaving through its attacks as they ascended toward the docking bay's exit. The freighter's cannons, which had seemed inoperative moments ago, now fired with deadly accuracy, forcing the interceptor to break off. "We've got an opening," Arden shouted, pushing the engines to their limit. The freighter shot through the magnetic field that sealed the bay, emerging into the vast expanse of space. The stars stretched out before them, a breathtaking canvas of light and darkness. But the interceptor wasn't done. It followed them out, its weapons primed for another attack. Arden's jaw tightened as he prepared for one last desperate maneuver. Before he could act, Lyric stood, their hands glowing with the same energy they'd used before. They stepped to the viewport, their voice calm and commanding. "Enough." A wave of light pulsed from Lyric, passing through the ship and out into the void. The interceptor froze mid-pursuit, its systems flickering and then shutting down entirely. It drifted, powerless, as the freighter accelerated away. Arden stared at Lyric, his chest heaving. "What the hell was that?" Lyric turned to him, their glow fading. "A choice. One I hope they will not force me to make again." Arden slumped back in his seat, a shaky laugh escaping him. "Remind me never to underestimate you." Lyric's expression softened, a faint smile touching their lips. "And remind me to trust more often. It appears to have its merits." The freighter drifted into the quiet expanse, the danger behind them. For the first time since their paths had crossed, Arden felt a glimmer of hope. The odds had been impossible, the stakes overwhelming, but they'd made it, together. "So," he said after a moment, glancing at Lyric, "where to now?" Lyric's gaze turned to the stars, their eyes shimmering with possibilities. "Somewhere safe, somewhere new." Arden nodded, a genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Sounds like a plan." And with that, they disappeared into the endless horizon, two unlikely allies bound by trust, survival, and the promise of a second chance.